This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for your attendance, and you're very welcome here this afternoon. My name is Alex White. I'm Director General here at the Institute. It's great to see a full house for this discussion on such an important topic. So just to give you an outline of how things are going to work for the next hour and a quarter or so, we're going to commence proceedings with a keynote address by Jacky Fox, who's a Senior Managing Director and Global Lead for Security Strategy Practice at Accenture. Jacky's going to give us an opening keynote address of maybe 10, 15 minutes or so. Can I just take that opportunity that presents me to thank Accenture, to recognise their support and collaboration on the preparation and offering of this event. It's been great to work with Accenture, who are very valued supporters and members of the Institute. So after Jacky gives her opening keynote from here, we're then going to go to a moderated panel discussion with an excellent panel. Each of them is going to give opening remarks of maybe about sort of 3 minutes or so, and we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves on the panel for a little while. And then after that, Jacky will rejoin us on the stage, as it were, and we'll have a Q&A and an opportunity for our audience, both here in the room and also online, to join in the discussion. So if you're watching on Zoom, you can just use the Q&A function. And if you're in the audience here, of course, it's simpler. You will simply have to just put up your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone. So the Q&A, the whole event, the presentation, and then the Q&A discussions, all on the record. So we're not observing any Chatham House or confidentiality in relation to the actual discussion here in the building this afternoon. And welcome everybody once again, and also those of you online. So I'm going to begin by introducing, well, I'll tell you who the panel. We've got Richard Browne, who's Director of the National Cybersecurity Centre, Donald McCarthy, beside him there, Cybersecurity Lead for Ireland, for Accenture, and then Joyce Hackma, who's an Associate Fellow, the International Security Programme at Chatham House. It's wonderful that Joyce has come over to us for this event. So thank you to the panel in advance. But most importantly, our distinguished keynote speaker, first of all, delighted to welcome to the stage Jacky Fox, who leads Accenture's global cybersecurity strategy practice. She's over 30 years experience in technology and cybersecurity consulting. And she holds an MSc in digital investigations and forensic computing, a GCFA and a GICSP. You'll all know what they are. She's worked across multiple industry sectors, including health and public services, resources and financial services, and elsewhere. She specialises in helping organisations to understand and treat their cyber risk, and has had the experience of investigating many national and international breaches. And I know that she has experience right up to the present day in these matters, and we're looking forward to hear perhaps some of that. She's also a vice chair on the board of Cyber Ireland. She's previously been an adjunct lecturer in UCD. She's a member of the World Economic Forum, speaking at Davos in 2022, and contributes actively to other security fora at international conferences and at Interpol. So really delighted to have Jacky Fox here, and it's my pleasure to invite you to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And it's my pleasure to be here today. You'll have to forgive me. I'm a little bit jet lagged, actually, because I've been traveling recently. So forgive me if I lose track halfway through this. My apologies. So the topic today that we're all here to discuss is around building Ireland's cyber resiliency. And it's a topic that's very close to my heart. It's something that I believe that we have a big focus on in this country at the moment. And unfortunately, we were the recipient of what happened with the HSE a number of years ago, which I was very actively involved in the response to that. But I think it actually has sharpened the mind of people in Ireland about what can happen, you know, the potential of what a cyber attack can actually do. So there are a couple of areas that I would like to touch off with you today. One of them is around geopolitics, and another is around digital sovereignty. And I want to speak a little bit about AI as well. And geopolitics is an area that, as I started off with a career in technology, I never thought that I would have to know anything about politics. I was like, well, what's that got to do with me? But actually, now I realize that I cannot do my job without understanding the political relationship between one country and another. I just can't. You know, if somebody has software from country X and they are sitting in country Y, that is something that clients that I work with need to actually understand. And what does it mean to them? Like, is it a risk in their supply chain? Is it not? So geopolitics is an area that I've become very interested in because of the nature of this job. And you mentioned I do a lot of work with the World Economic Forum. So I've had the privilege of working with them on their global cyber outlook and writing it with them over the last 5 years. And every year we ask questions to the really senior leaders across the world, their CEOs, their CISOs of the biggest companies. And we get to ask this right across the globe. So we can get a view of, well, what are people feeling in the United States versus how's this sitting in China? How's this sitting in Latin America? And it's actually very interesting looking at the dynamics. But I want to quote a couple of those statistics as I'm talking to you today. But just to point out, these are global statistics that I'm talking to you about here. So I'm not breaking it down by country. So if some of them you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound like what I think in Europe, it's because it's how things have been thought of globally. So one of the questions we asked people this year was, do you believe that your cyber resilience is insufficient? And we broke it down between private and public sector. And across the private sector, 11% of people said, yes, I do believe that it's insufficient. And bear in mind, these are not small organizations that we're asking. There's a really high qualifying bar as to who gets to answer this question. And across the public sector, 23% of public sector bodies said that they believe their cyber resiliency is insufficient. Now, you know, as to why they believe that, we didn't kind of dig in underneath as to what they were thinking about that. But they're quite stark figures when you're thinking about, you know, public sector, and that's broadly, you know, kind of critical national infrastructure, government, you know, kind of core government offices. That's how people are thinking about where they are. And we asked people then, you know, from a geopolitical perspective, how many organizations had actually taken geopolitics into consideration in their cybersecurity strategies about what they're doing to protect their organization. And 91% of organizations said that they had actually taken it into account in their strategy, which again shows that, you know, 10 years ago, if we'd asked somebody that question, they would have gone, what? What are you talking about? You know, they would even have been, some people would even have gone, what are you talking about cybersecurity? But now every organization really understands that. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot go on in the world about, you know, what does my third parties mean to me that in my ecosystem? And this concept of what we would call cyber inequality has been quite strong, where we see that a large organization has a lot of small organizations that are leading into them as third parties. And the reality is those third-party organizations are often small. They don't have the investment that they might need, but the larger organization is exposed in the manner of the smaller organization. So there's this inequality that's there about people's ability to invest in what they need to do in order to secure their organization, and the downstream impact or the upstream impact of that is very high. So that's something that I think we should all be very, very concerned about. Another couple of things around geopolitics that often hit me is we have this concept that if there's a weather event in a country in Europe, let's say, that people will come in from other countries to help. And we have a reasonable, now you may not agree with this statement, a reasonable certainty about predicting the weather. So, you know, but we can say there's a storm coming. We know that power cables, for example, are going to get hit, or there could be an issue with our reservoirs. So we can plan around that, and we can bring people in, and we equally so allow our people to go to other countries to help. And you'd like to think that when there's emergencies around something like cybersecurity, that we can have that mutual assistance concept. But the reality is if something really happens bad in a country, can you actually say, well, we can predict when that's going to happen to my country, therefore I will let people go to assist. So it's a sort of an area that I feel, while we are collaborating kind of internationally, we're sort of a little bit on our own as well. Because at the end of the day, we, in whatever country we're in, it's our interest in keeping our system safe. And while other people don't want the knock-on effect of us being a third party, but at the end of the day, it's our services, our electricity, our water, our hospitals that we're trying to keep up and running because they matter to the people here. And can we really rely on people outside to make that kind of work for us? So what do we think of as the common destabilizers in that space, and particularly for our critical national infrastructure? So I think one of the first things in that area that would come to my mind is around espionage. Often people would be looking in a network and actually they're just pulling data off it. They're not necessarily intending on bringing it down. They might inadvertently do it, or they might sit there one day with an idea that they could do that. But that's the sort of thing that we'd be seeing in that pace. And, we know around Ireland, recently there's been drone sightings and things like that, which may not be linked to those two things, but there have been questions asked about that kind of thing in recent times. The other thing that we would see is about the ability to disrupt. Can something be disrupted? And we've been the recipient of that with the HSE, how our medical services were disrupted very badly. But, if you're looking in a country and saying, what do we want to keep secure? What are really our critical things? And within each organization and each company, we also need to think like that as well. What is it about my company that I really need to keep up and running to make sure that I can provide the services or produce the product that I normally do? And we do realize that, the definition of critical national infrastructure has expanded a lot in recent years. We used to only think about it in relation to utilities and road infrastructure, whereas now we realize that pharma and food and all those areas are actually very important within that. And the other thing that's very notable kind of in our current kind of threat landscape out there from a geopolitics perspective is around dis and misinformation. And we saw that in Ireland, with the recent presidential kind of elections and campaigns, that there was, we see what's going out in social media, and how people are intending to, influence public opinion or to, make destabilizing statements. So again, this is very real. And I feel sorry for a lot of organizations that I talk to day because they have literally just finished globalizing themselves. They've just finished it, tick, done that. And now everyone's saying to them, well, maybe from a geopolitical perspective, you need to have the ability to segment your organization. And so that is actually really hard for people to take on board as a concept. But I've worked with many organizations where they actually have needed to segment because something has happened to them where they need to cut off one arm from another arm within an organization, where to allow them to keep manufacturing or to do those things or to stop information flow at times of war, or there may have been new legislation that was passed in a particular country that means that they just need to behave differently there. So all these things are very complex and have a huge impact on cybersecurity and the resilience that we see today. So another area, and I need to watch the time here now. Am I okay? That's very important today is digital sovereignty, and we hear that been spoken around a lot. And what is the definition of that? Like in my head, you look at maybe let's say within the realms of cloud security, where is the data actually resident? Where is the operational control on looking after that kind of cloud system or whatever you've put kind of up into the cloud? But it's actually a little bit trickier. We can understand that. We can say, my data is in this country, and occasionally people from outside this country may need to come in and manage that. Or sometimes I may have put something in place that if there was a catastrophic event in this country, that my data may move somewhere else. And we understand that. We sign up to that in a contract. We know what we're getting. But it's a little bit harder when you're looking at extraterritorial laws and how that impacts, whether somebody can actually, in a country where your data may be sitting, have access to that in a way that you may not have necessarily signed up to because the laws in that jurisdiction allow that to take place. So I think that's quite an interesting perspective, from a sovereignty view. And you flip that round and you say, well, could we actually lock ourselves in a box and have everything here in Ireland and look after ourselves? And you say, well, what would that actually mean? So could we actually build all our digital infrastructure from the bare metal, from the BIOS, all the way up to what we're using? Could we build our own operating systems? Could we have applications that were as good as what you can buy from the global marketplace? And today, the answer on that is probably no. Would we aspire to do it at the moment? I don't believe that we necessarily would. Could we start thinking like that in the future? Potentially. We might start thinking like that. It's been very interesting watching the stock market lately on the view of, these large kind of software giants, for want of a better word. What is the impact of AI going to have on them? Like, in 5 years' time, could I actually go, please build me an application that will do all this for me, sit in Ireland, not have any reachers outside Ireland? I think that's quite a feasible idea, but is it something that we'd actually want to do? So that strikes me about sovereignty as well. And you do hear a lot of conversations going on about, within Europe, about having the EU OS, like to have an operating system that has been built, maintained, ring-fenced in the US. Again, people ask these questions. There are groups who are working this out, whether this is a sensible thing, whether it's a feasible thing. I think these conversations will become a lot more prevalent as time goes on. A conversation that I have with a lot of people lately is around quantum cryptography, and it's difficult to say that when you're a bit jet lagged, and the controls that we have around that. And again, we all know what's going to happen in that space. As time goes on, we know that, the traditional kind of types of cryptography, will be broken. You will be able to see things. People have gathered stuff. They'll be able to see it in the future. And so we've countered that with actually using quantum safe cryptographic algorithms. But at the moment, these aren't considered to be weapons of any sort. But I wonder if export controls were put on them in the future, how would we fare in Ireland? Like, do we have our own cryptographic kind of quantum safe? No, we don't. Like, does Europe have them? No. Like, should we be looking at, from an academic point of view, putting money and funds and research into doing something like that? It's not a question for the likes of me to answer. I can only answer to you that technically, I know we don't have that at the moment. And is it a protection that we would like to have? So I'm having that debate with a lot of people in a lot of corners at the moment, and it's very interesting, particularly in the World Economic Forum. Actually, that comes up a lot. We've seen a lot of cases where at the moment, different countries are saying, I don't want software from there anymore. Like, we've seen it in Europe with countries stating it, and we've seen it in Asia with countries stating this. And it's quite an interesting concept about what happens when we start looking inwards and saying we are only going to use something that are from like-minded countries. And what happens if those like-minded countries that we're friends with today, that we're not friends with them tomorrow? What happens in that situation? What is our resiliency plan then as to what we're going to do? So, and I am conscious of time now, so I do need to kind of wrap up. So I'm not going to go into AI, but happy to talk to anybody about that in the break afterwards. But just some parting thoughts on this. We do a lot around kind of regulation to try and make sure that people are setting the bare minimum that they need in place to actually work in today's society. But I hope I've raised a few more kind of things for the panel to discuss, which might be slightly more controversial, but I think hopefully you found them interesting. So on that, I'm going to hand back to you, Alex. And sorry if I went over.
Thank you very much, Jacky. Thanks for setting the agenda so effectively and clearly for the discussion that's going to follow now. And I've mentioned that we have a really super panel here. I'm going to go first to Richard Browne. Richard was appointed director of the National Cybersecurity Centre in 2021. And as Jacky was speaking there, at one point she mentioned that, I think you said 10 years ago or 12 years ago, nobody was talking about cybersecurity and very few people knew what it even meant or was. Well, one of the people who knew what it meant and was Richard Browne, I can assure you. Having had the privilege of working with Richard when I was Minister for Communications, and he certainly knew what was happening and knew what was emerging and was really a leading person in the field even then. And now he's in such an important role. I was delighted to have him here on the panel. He also previously held roles in the Department of the Taoiseach and, as I mentioned, in government departments, including Environment, Communications and Climate Action. And of course, worked setting up really the national cybersecurity infrastructure for us between 2014 and 2020. So, Richard, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Your sort of initial thoughts by way of response.
I'll do my best not to call you minister. Well,
Sorry.
first of all, thanks
Yeah,
for the invitation.
sure.
It's great to see so many familiar faces here from various different departments and manifestations over the years. So I'll cover three things really briefly. First of all, where we are, where we're going, and what we need to do in that order. So it's first of all, what have we done? So the NCSC is the state's National Cybersecurity Centre. We do incident detection, management, response. We have a whole range of roles in capacity building, in resilience building, and in compliance. So what have we done? Well, we built a national cybersecurity incident response team, or CSIRT. It's now a global standard. It operates at the highest global standard. Not my language. We have pieces of paper and peer reviews to support it. We've regulated critical infrastructure extensively since 2018. So we've been across 125 critical infrastructure entities. There's people from the compliance team in the room, who we've been in people's offices, in people's factories and facilities for that length of time, building compliance and building resilience. And we built sharing arrangements. So we share information nationally and internationally at every level of national security classification. We share with NATO, we share with the European Union, we share with peers globally. And then we built huge capacity, not just us ourselves in the NCSC, but collectively in the state, in academia, in consulting, in industry. There's huge capability has emerged. And if you look just at the number of new master's courses and PhD courses in academia in the last 2 years alone, we're on a very positive trajectory. That's great. Okay, it's not nowhere near enough. So in December, we published this. This is our new national cyber risk assessment. It's on our website. It's at the time, I say at the time, it's already out of date, was our benchmark assessment of what risks the state faces now and into the future, what we need to do in policy terms going forward. It calls out three substantive systematic cyber risks. First of these flows from the degrading geopolitical environment and the security environment more specifically. What particularly it calls out is the fact that A, we have kinetic war in Europe, which leads to a whole series of very obvious first order risks, but also because we're seeing the more profligate and indiscriminate use of cyber tools, there's a real risk now that we'll have further second order effects as these tools become more available to criminal actors and lower order state actors and more widely used. Has particular implications for states like ours, because we sit at the crux of a lot of global networks and contain and manage a lot of global data. That's number one. Number two, we have a series of pressing challenges. They're no longer theoretical in AI and post-quantum cryptography. Collectively, we refer to them as emerging disruptive threats. These are real issues. They're not theoretical. They're live issues today. We will have a post-quantum roadmap published very shortly, which will set out the state's roadmap for being post-quantum ready. AI, I'll come back to. Then the last thing, and this is the golden thread that runs right throughout that document, is supply chain. And supply chain is a challenge, not just because of the fact that we know there are third countries that use their own supply arrangements to exert influence on their own companies, but because also of a whole range of other types of cyber incidents that flow from supply chain compromise. One of them is the so-called one-to-many attack, whereby an attack on a vendor or a part of the supply chain can have implications globally. And the CrowdStrike incident last year, a year before that, is a very clear example of that. So those are the risks. I said it's out of date. It's out of date because even since October, we've seen a dramatic increase in the use of AI by threat actors. Very obvious one, very public one, is the incident in Poland at the end of December, where their electricity grid was targeted by their own reckoning by Sandworm in 1944. And Poland have published a really good report on that, by the way, which calls out
which calls out the threat actor in great detail and outlines the types of tools that were used. AI was a heavy part of that attack. That's new. It's a genuinely new thing. So that's great. So what do we need to do about all of that? Well, at the basic level, the basics will continue. We have to continue to do incident response. We have to continue to build resilience. There's a whole range of new compliance networks coming. NIS2 will be transposed here in the next 3 or 4 months, but CRA will follow in September. So this homework will continue, and it's utterly critical. But beyond that, and at a national level, and the recommendations of the NCRA make this very clear, we need to dramatically increase the extent to which we automate our responses, nationally, organizationally, and within companies and public sector entities. We need to be building systems that automate detection and response using AI to anticipate a coming problem. Simple terms, the question is of velocity. In AI, it is entirely possible now for attackers, and a wider number of attackers than previously, to conduct attacks that happen very, very quickly. That narrows the window we have to do detection and response. That means that that detection and response has to happen locally, and it has to happen extremely quickly. That's the long and short of it. There's two other things we need to do. We have a program in the NCSC we call NCDS, or National Cyber Defence Services. It's run for several years. The legislation will give us the legal basis to extend that dramatically. That would allow us to manage the national risk profile in a much more aggressive way. We need to do that. There's a lot behind that. The other thing we need to do is build a national detection network. Today in the NCSC, we see public sector data. We can map, manage, and track all the information coming into and out of the public sector. We can use our vast amount of threat intelligence and everything else to find risks and threats in that. Great, it's not enough. We need to extend that out to cover critical infrastructure. We need much better granular visibility of the risks and threats as they present to critical infrastructure. And of course, this is very obvious, but at the back end of all of that, the information we collect, parse, analyze, feeds into much better data insights for government on national security issues, risks, and threats. It's way over time. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Richard. I'll go directly to Donald Ogue. Donald Ogue McCarthy is the Ireland cybersecurity lead for Accenture. Prior to working in Accenture, Donald Ogue was director and head of cloud engineering at Deloitte. He was also formerly technical lead and solution architect at 8 West Consulting for a number of years, I think for 5 years. And you're with Accenture now, and I think have heard and know how active Accenture is in this field in terms of, I suppose, not just assistance to companies and others where problems arise, but the critical, that we've heard from both the speakers already, this sort of critical requirement to be prepared and to understand what threats are before they land.
Yeah,
and so over to you for your thoughts, initial thoughts.
As Richard said, maybe I can take that golden thread from what Jacky and Richard both said.
Yeah.
And I guess it's safe to say that in Europe, cybersecurity has never been more of a current topic, and NIS2 and CRA have helped level up a lot of critical services and public things. But I guess what I'm seeing and what we're seeing is, while cyber resilience, of course, is the thing we all care about, it's now embedded in a much more fundamental business resilience discussion. Because I'm involved in both helping many organizations build the necessary tools and services and people, but also helping them recover, unfortunately, after some of these attacks have occurred, which is my lived experience right now. And I guess in those conversations, really what's coming up is, what is the core element of my business? Not what tools and technology should I recover first, but actually what do I need tomorrow that's fundamental to my organization? And while cyber resilience isn't of that, it's a much more fundamental focus on, have I clear of tomorrow what I need to have up and running? And every organization that has suffered a significant event has a slightly different answer. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of my secure digital core, that bit in the middle, that bit at the center, that's most important to me. Do I have that in place? Do I know what it is? And then the majority, unfortunately, of organizations that you will engage with, perhaps, that have had that terrible event, it's not that clear. And I suppose it's on all of us, when we think about the topic of today, a resilient Ireland, a resilient set of businesses inside Ireland, that view of what are those, thank you, what is that core part of my business that I must have up and running, is really important. And in fact, it can be difficult for many of the CISOs in the room, many of the security professionals, to keep attracting the investment that you need. But actually, we've done some research to try and understand, is there a link between having this secure digital core, this focus on a segmented network, really clear data classification, really hardened infrastructure, and my business outcomes? And what we discovered is that those organizations that have that secure digital core have higher rates of revenue growth and higher levels of profit than their peers that do not have that secure digital core. And so elevating the conversation beyond
pure cyber, but making sure that actually what we're really talking about here is our business and the things that matter to us most. And so in this panel discussion, I'm looking forward to pulling into more detail on that, I guess, to think a little bit more broadly around how do we attract that investment for all of the cyber programs that we want and we need. When we think about the things that Richard has discussed, we think about the things that were mentioned earlier around cryptographic agility and our ability to prepare for things like quantum, which will happen and is coming. Thank you.
That's terrific, Donald, and we'll come back to some of those issues. The third and final panelist, it's my pleasure to introduce Joyce Hackma. She's a senior expert in international cyber and technology policy with 2 decades of experience shaping global debates on cybersecurity, emerging technologies, digital governance. She's with Chatham House. We talk about Chatham House often here, refer to it anyway, sometimes the Chatham House rule, but of course we know Chatham House well and have had plenty of very fruitful dealings with them over the years. You've been there since 2016, and from 22 to 25, you served as Deputy Director of the International Security Programme at Chatham House, where she defined strategic direction and cemented the programme's status as a leading global authority on cyber technology and international security. Joyce is a widely published author. Her work spans cyber governance, emerging technology risk, geopolitics, international security, and much else. And I have plenty more here I could say about you, but we'll hold it and pass it on to you now for your opening thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex, for having me. And it's great to be here in Dublin. It's been a long time since I visited, and it's great to be here and listen to all these perspectives about how do we achieve cyber resilience. And if I may, I want to touch on the topic from a slightly different angle, basically looking at how do we achieve resilience against those cyber threats that impact our national security, our economic security, that really kind of fundamentally impact us all. And in order to sort of answer this question, I think, there are a few other questions that we need to ask. What are these threats that we are worried about? Who is behind them? And how are they manifesting? And if we look at cyberspace at the moment, what we see is that actors are operating in each other's networks on a regular, continuous basis. So we have to kind of move a little bit our thinking from this is like, we handle a one-off attack and we move on into the next. This is a space, cyberspace has become a space with continuous engagement, persistent engagements from actors that are looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. And this is no longer basically confined to state actors. What we are seeing increasingly is that criminals are getting very much in the business of states. We are seeing criminal syndicates getting very sophisticated in conducting their operations. And more worryingly is that they are also working in concert with states, or states turning a blind eye to what they are doing. So that is really of concern. Richard touched on the proliferation of cyber tools that is becoming much more available to all these actors, whereas in the past, the ones who could do like sophisticated attacks were the states with the big resources. Now we have something called cybercrime as a service, which means you can buy these things almost like off the shelf, on the dark web, etc., which meant that the sort of threat landscape has been transformed quite a lot. And the other thing is, of course, AI and how AI is playing a big role in that. We heard the Poland example, but in September of last year, Anthropic basically published a report where they said we have detected and disrupted the first automated cyber espionage attack that have used our system in order to do that. So that is really worrying. So then kind of brings me to the questions, what can we do about that? This is a space that is very complex, that geopolitics is very much at the heart of this. It is driving it. It's not just cyber, it's also hybrid threats that we are dealing with, both in the physical and the digital domain. And I think to me, one of the things that we need to accept is that we cannot protect cyberspace 100%. What we can do is try and sort of close all the gaps that allows these attackers to infiltrate our systems and conduct their attacks. And one of the main really kind of weak points that we continue to have is that we have a software problem. We have weak softwares that are basically legacy systems, unpatched code, that are known vulnerabilities that lots of these attackers exploit. So it's not necessarily always finding sophisticated or undisclosed vulnerabilities. There are lots of vulnerabilities that are there that are being exploited regularly, and we haven't fixed them. The reason why we haven't fixed them is that because it is expensive, it takes a long time, and the market incentives have not really driven sort of these vendors to think about security by design. We need to change that. And AI offers an opportunity to help us produce, secure code, but also fix the problems and vulnerabilities that we have in our code at a scale and in a cheap way, in a way that wasn't possible before. Of course, that requires leadership and a bunch of other things, but there is an opportunity that we can touch on here. The other thing that I want to mention is that, I mentioned earlier that this space is that you have your actors basically in the backyard. If it's the analogy of a home, constantly poking to see where can I see an open window? Is there an open door to get through that? And what we can do is close those doors, close these windows, make sure that we're not letting them, come in. But what we can also do, and there's lots of arguments that are being put forward towards. And there's obviously some controversy around that towards like proactive engagement. You need to, the way they are engaging in your networks, you also need to engage in their networks. And the purpose is not to destroy their capabilities, but to change how they think, how they decide, how they behave, which is what in the UK, the National Cyber Force refers to as the doctrine of cognitive effect. And the last thing is that, the cyber threats are inherently transnational. So it is true, and I agree with Jacky, that we have to take responsibilities as countries and say, this is our responsibility to protect our systems, and we have to be, the first ones leading that. But there is also an element that, the threat themselves are transnational. So you would have people operating from different jurisdictions, impacting victims in various different jurisdictions. And we need to come together in order to, disrupt them. And last year, there was an operation called Operation Kronos, where we had law enforcement from around 15 countries come together, plus Europol, plus Eurojust, and they were able to disrupt one of the biggest ransomware gangs known as Lockbit, and they were able to disrupt and severely impact their basically their business model and disclose the members, etc. So there is something that can be achieved by coming together and by disrupting them at the infrastructure level and at different layers. And to conclude, I think, and we talked about that earlier, there's not one measure that we need to take that will actually fix things. This is a problem that is very complicated and very complex and requires a multifaceted approach that involves all of us here in the room and not just one or two actors. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I sort of pick up on that last point? I was going to go back to Donlove on this because I would like to ask each of you on this question of regulation, which of course comes by way of legislation. What is the right balance between all of the other strategies that you've all been outlining in terms of resilience and preparedness and interventions, expertise being available to organizations, so on the one hand, and actual intervention by legislation and the installation of robust regulatory systems? I mean, I'll come to Richard last on that because, of course, that's what he's about. Not only about that, but principally about that. Donlove, I might come to you first, and maybe if you just think about it on two levels, the principle of regulation first of all, and there's so much talk about that now, and some, not just in this field, but generally in digital, and it's going on a lot. Discussion is going on. The principle, but then because laws don't have extraterritorial effects. So really, we're talking about legislation and regulation that has a broader remit than simply just within one jurisdiction. So the principle and then the extraterritorial.
Yeah, aspect. And I guess where I sit in that conversation is how I take that. And
sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble with the lapel mic, so we'll have to pass them.
I guess where I operate most in that scenario is, how do I take what you've just said and actually do something, implement it? And that's the challenge for many people in the room is, I guess, harmonization is one word. Another word is I have a lot of competing agenda items when it comes to that. how do I prioritize what I need to do? And I guess the danger zone at the moment is I'm so overwhelmed with the scenario you just described that I miss out on the conversation I've just had to my left and right, which is there are real threats there that I actually need to protect against. And where I've seen it implemented most successfully is where the risk and regulatory component of an organization starts to span out a lot more deeper into engineering, infrastructure, architecture, business decisions. Some people call it fluency. So cyber fluency starts to become a lot more embedded, both at the leadership level, but also down in the lower parts of the organization. And things like NIS2 have brought that to life. You know, any directors in the room will be very keenly aware of their obligations under that legislation that Richard has alluded to earlier. And I think the combination of those things has meant that there's a lot more focus across the organization, and that's the change that needs to occur. Because you need to translate it into real action, and it can be really challenging.
Interesting. I'm going to ask each of the panel and you did, so it's not a reproach, but to keep the responses in this kind of tight enough so that we can move it on. I'm going to go back to you, Joyce, on this issue.
I mean, I think when we think about regulation, to me, like the first thing that we need to think about is regulation for what? What is the problem that we are trying to address? And because, you know, what we don't want to do is regulation for the sake of regulation. And the other thing is that we need to ask ourselves, how does that sit with the remaining body of regulations that we are introducing or that we have in place? And Donald talked about, like, you know, the fragmentation and the risk of that. Because, you know, if you have fragmented regulation, what you end up with is also superficial compliance, right? So we need to make sure that the regulation is speaking to the objective. So to kind of continue with the train of thought that I had on software, you know, sort of the software design, and how do we go towards, like, you know, security by default? You know, regulation obviously can play a big role in that, in shifting the sort of the onus or the burden from the user to the vendor, because at the moment the vendors have no incentive to produce secure products, right? Because, you know, users continue to buy the products. The price is the main driver to a certain extent. So how do we shift that? Regulation can shift the incentives, can also define the sort of the framework of liability when vendors, you know, adopt or opt for negligent design choices. So regulations has a very important role to play, but we need to make sure that it sort of sits, it achieves its goal, it's fit for purpose, and it sits well with the kind of the remaining body. There is a term that I quite like called the regulatory diplomacy, which is basically a tool to address threats to national security that happen because of regulatory fragmentation. So, you know, it is really a very serious issue, and we need to be very careful about it.
Regulatory diplomacy, Richard.
I learned the term science diplomacy over the weekend, so we'll remember this. I suppose fundamentally the reason for all this regulation, and there's a lot of it and more coming, is because of two asymmetries: an information asymmetry and a risk asymmetry. The risk asymmetry is that society and governments have become dependent on infrastructure and systems that are provided by private companies who don't share the degree of risk. That's first and most important thing. It's needed for that reason, but it doesn't fix the underlying economic problems. So it's not by any means the whole solution, and any solution will take time. So the CRA, which is starting to come into effect, Cyber Resilience Act, in September, will likely have a 10, 15-year lifespan before it has real effect, because it's essentially designed to iron out or push out non-compliant or insecure infrastructure. Some of the infrastructure has a 10 or 15-year lifespan. That's the window. So that's the piece. The closing really quickly, it's not the whole solution or anything like it. It will fix underlying problems over time. It will address underlying challenges and issues in organizations and governments, but there's a whole lot more that governments need to do to address the underlying challenge. And a lot of that involves the aggressive use of existing legal and regulatory tools, law enforcement tools like Operation Cronus, which, look it up, it's a phenomenal operation. It was really impressive. And there's more things that organizations like ours can be doing as well, to iron out risk in a really aggressive, granular way.
Interesting. I'll stay with you, Richard, just on a slightly different topic. I think you touched on it, if I'm not mistaken, certainly it came up. Skills, the kind of skills that are needed to ensure, you know, cyber secure and cyber resilient, not just companies, but societies. You know, the distinction between, I suppose, more generalist skills, to promote for the population at large, and all the, the courses that short courses we all have to do when we see a new piece of, and then the cybersecurity specialist workforce that we need, and that you must presumably have, good exposure to, and you're leading as well in many ways.
Yeah, that's the real question.
Yeah.
I suppose, first of all, cyber skills are a national security challenge. So a state that doesn't have the appropriate skill set in the jurisdiction, they can't access that for industry or for government, has a problem. That's a real issue. We're very lucky, by the way, that UCD particularly has had this forensic masters in cyber course running for many years. Lots of people in the room have done it. I've met at least 2, if not 3, directors of European NCSCs who've done the same course in UCD. So we've had a head start here. A lot of my team have done it, obviously. So that's a key issue. We've seen, like I said, a lot of new master's programs emerging across the state, and PhD programs. And one of the things we have in the program for government is the creation of a new cybersecurity centre of excellence, which will happen in the next year and a half. That's how long it takes to build a program now. But that's happening. So that's all extremely positive. We've had a role, but only a partial. Industry and academia are really central to all of this, and the likes of Cyber Ireland. But below that, and more generally, there's a vast amount of work happening in training second level students and people outside of the educational system. We've run junior cycle short courses for many years. Where the next national cybersecurity strategy, fingers crossed, which will happen this year, will contain further measures at broader education in second level. Not just because people need to know it in their general life, but also to try and push people into the careers that we need them to go into to get that master's or PhD to work in the NCSC.
Super. That's terrific. Donald Logue, on that?
Yeah, you asked kind of 2 questions, I think. One part is the societal knowledge. I think what's really interesting when you hear about some of the things that have happened to organizations, they started with quite a traditional threat, like a phishing attack. Like there's a really simple start to all these things, which amplifies the need for education of people at large. That's the first part. Because I think while they are significant, they are criminal acts. Let's be clear, things in the UK, they were criminals. They were criminal acts that were perpetrated in those organizations, but came from a place that someone didn't know something was happening to them, and it was something simple. I guess in terms of those cyber skills that Richard talked about, I guess I can give an example for us. We're looking in different places because there is a gap in cyber skills are not found commonplace in the market any longer. And we're looking in different places. We're training people differently. We're bringing them in through different channels into our organization for ourselves and for many of you. And so I think we have to think differently about where we're going to find the cyber skills of the future, because they're not going to come from the traditional locations we used to look at before. And it is a significant threat to us here.
Sure. Interesting. Joyce, you've written about the whole of society approach that you advocated in the UK context. Would you want to pick up on this and maybe?
Absolutely. I think where we have not done a great job is in telling a good story about what cyber is, because cyber can feel very abstract to people, even for policymakers, the C-suite, etc. They sometimes struggle to understand what it actually means in practice and what is the impact. And I think we need to get on the generalist kind of point. We need to get better at telling the story around, what are the things that we are worried about and how to better protect ourselves. And we all know that if we adopt basic cyber hygiene measures, lots of the the attacks that happen can be prevented. So there is a kind of a story around our responsibility in telling a better story and having a better narrative that is accessible to people. We need the techies as well, but we also need techies who are able to influence, who can also speak in an accessible language. Because if you have techies who can only speak in computer language, that becomes quite difficult to communicate and to impact and influence their seniors. But on the shortage, that's actually quite a serious issue. A recent parliamentary report in the UK found that there is a long-standing shortage. There are not enough people, not enough money, right? That the government is not willing to pay the salaries that these kind of skills people require. Not enough diversity in the workforce that they have. And they have long-term or long recruitment processes that is not helping achieving that. There are lots of initiatives that have been put in place, similar to what Richard mentioned, but this continues to be an issue.
Just a quick final wrap before I bring in the audience. I'll stay with Joyce, if I may. So lessons learned from high-profile events that have occurred. So Jaguar Land Rover, for example, the one we all read about here. I mean, I'm sure that, I mean, I know there have been others that you've written about, but, and then I'm going to ask the two colleagues here about, for example, the HSE in our, what, just lessons learned in 30 seconds, 1 minute.
30 seconds. After the Jaguar and the kind of the M&S and all these attacks, there was a letter that ministers sent to like CEOs in the UK. They basically asked them for 3 things. You need to own cyber risk at the board level. If you don't have that, then this is a problem. You need to sign up to early warning service because that helps you, recover and address the issue as it happens. And you need to have like minimum standard of cybersecurity, what they call in the UK, the cyber essentials. These are like, any organization, every organization need to have them. We always make the argument that smaller organizations don't have the resources. That is true, but it is also true that there are lots of available tools out there that, if you are, if you look in the right way, you'll find them, right? But there is a communication issue that goes both ways. And I think in the UK, some of the lessons that are, that continue to be learning, obviously this is an economic security issue, and we need to think about it differently. There is now a cybersecurity and resilience bill in Parliament where, part and parcel of that is to think about what are the obligations of these different kind of companies that are providing services to my critical infrastructure. How should they do it? This is the first time that they are trying to regulate those.
Sure.
So all of these lessons will kind of...
Richard, I wonder, can you roll back like a complete layperson to know nothing about this, apart from a lot of what I've learned today, and can you roll the tape, can you roll the video back when there's an event, an offense like HSE? And is there a way of, not expecting you to tell us the detail, but is there a way of looking at the specifics of what happened, by playing the tape backwards, if you know what I mean, and seeing how did this happen and what can we learn from it? Sorry for the stupid layman's way.
No, not at all. The answer is yes in every conceivable way.
Right.
So first of all, a large amount of what we do in incident response is collecting IOCs or indicators of compromise and the technical data associated with the actual incident, analyzing that and then sharing that live during the incident. In HSE, we'd share the IOCs from the incident before 11 o'clock that morning. I found out at 6:46.
Right.
That's sharing with out to national stakeholders, but also European, NATO, across the Atlantic as well. So the incident was shared everywhere that morning in the details. But more importantly, at a national level, there's 2 different layers of like recursive feedback loops here. One is that we take the learnings from the incident, what the entity was doing, and we use it in direct enforcement on the entity in some cases, which we did in the HSE case, but also then in terms of feeding into national policy. So that's thing 1. But thing 2 is, even more importantly from our narrow perspective, is that we do after action reviews in every incident response process. So our incident response gets better every time. So on the back of HSE, we revised our National Emergency Response Plan and published it. So we've published Cyber Emergency Response Plan. Then every incident we've done since, we do an after action review, which feeds into our own internal incident response planning, because every incident is different, but they evolve on top of each other. We need to be ready, not for the last one. Next.
Terrific. And Donald, finally to you on this one, and the extent to which there's a sufficient level of cooperation between public sector and private sector, because of course HSE in the public sector, but what's happening in terms of an ability to work with the private sector actors as well.
Yeah, I think HSE and some of the UK examples that Joyce mentioned are examples of where collaboration actually did occur and had to occur really quickly. And we talked about skills, we talked about paying right salaries to attract the right people into public sector. Actually, those stories have never amplified that point more strongly, that when that terrible event occurs, the people you need to call, whether private sector or public sector, are your friends across industry. We've seen that in the Polish example pre-Christmas, where they were able to deploy significant support from outside their organization to help them defend countries' critical national infrastructure. That's actually the key point, is you're going to have to collaborate, and you are going to have to be able to call upon the support from Richard and organizations like him. And so all of us have to amplify that message, I think, of how important that's going to be this year, next year, EU presidency coming. all these things are going to be critically important for us.
Super. Okay. I'm going to throw it open to the floor and to invite questions and observations. But Jacky, would you like to join us? Would you mind rejoining us here if we can fit? Ronan Kelly says, as a young-ish person, he put ish in brackets, so we'll allow that. We'll let that go. Early in their cybersecurity career, he's curious whether the panel sees any area that has been underinvested in for years and now urgently needs deeper educational focus. Who'd like to pick that one up? An area that's been underinvested in for years and now urgently needs deeper educational focus. And while you're thinking about that, Ita Ryan says she loves Joyce's input on software security. Mm-hmm. Joyce, what do you think about the NVD that enriches CVE information for vulnerabilities being effectively defunded in the US? Well, I know what US is.
I can deal with that one as well.
Yeah, okay. I should go to Joyce first, really, and maybe help us with NVD and CVE.
I think I'll probably kind of touch on the skills question.
Yeah, okay.
The underinvestment, I don't know if there's a kind of like something that no one has touched on that a youngish person can touch on, but I think something that is increasingly becoming an issue that we need to know more about and just get our heads around the full impact, both offensively and defensively, is the AI cyber nexus, right? Because we know we are learning things every day, but this is a new area where there's a lot will continue to happen, and where, the battle between who will get there first or who will win, is it the offenders or the defenders, is a very acute one.
Yes. And yes, Richard.
And then just to answer Edith's question, it's a great question, as you'd expect from someone from UCC.
We've outed her as a UCC.
So CVE is the coordinated vulnerability process that is run by the MITRE Corporation on behalf of the US government, by NIST, essentially. NIST has been variably funded in the recent past, is the polite way of describing it. And the CVE process is fundamental for people like us to understand the severity and importance of vulnerabilities, so we can actually manage and respond to them properly and appropriately. The European Union has stepped into that funding gap. ENISA, which is the European Network and Information Security Agency, with the support of member states like us, to ensure that they have the ability now to run the MITRE CVE process if MITRE itself is defunded and goes away. The German government have been instrumental in leading on some of this, with the support across the European Union and from non-EU European powers.
Very good. I have plenty of questions coming in online from our audience, but we will probably finish it not long after 2:15. So if you have a question in mind, this really is your time, because it'll be over before I'll come to you, Seamus, in a couple of minutes, but it'll be over before you know where it is. So bear that in mind. Yes. Yeah. Of course, Ambassador. Yes.
Ambassador Vital here in Dublin. Now, a question, because national security and cybersecurity, as was mentioned, I suppose, is a national security issue. So an issue for member states in the EU, but I think the EU framework, as you also just mentioned, is very important. So my question is the balance between the national sovereignty and national security element, and the importance and the dimension, the room for a stronger role, if needed, from the European Union in the coordination of these two elements. Thank you.
Donald or Jacky, would either of you like to comment on that? Yeah. You're a little quiet to my ear, but it's the main people I'm worried about, people online. I think you can be heard in the room.
So I think for me, there's a balance. We need both. We need to be cooperative with people around us, people from like-minded nations. We all need to work together. We're so interdependent on each other for many things, trade, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to kind of disambiguate cybersecurity from that. But on the other hand, we do need to think of ourselves as well, because we are an island, but even if we weren't, we are a country, a nation. And there are times when, kind of our friends may not be our friends, when they're looking after themselves, or they've just changed, like the geopolitical landscape has changed. So I think we need to think about both, about how we operate on our own, but how we cooperate with our peers as well.
Very good. I wonder, I'll just go to another question here from Srinath Monokuru, asks, how are organizations in Ireland preparing for the quantum world? And what guidance would the panel give them to ensure they stay ahead of emerging threats from quantum-capable threat actors? Donald Logan.
Great one. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, actually, a lot of people look at quantum and Q-Day is what typically in the industry we talk about when we think quantum computers will be ready to decrypt some of the algorithms that we would now consider legacy. But actually, that tends to delay decision making and think about it as something that's way, way far out that we don't need to think about. But the bit to think about now is what we call crypto agility. In other words, our ability to swap out those algorithms and those keys now if a new algorithm was to come on stream or a new mechanism to encrypt our data was to change. So while, yes, it is 2030 perhaps, actually there is things we need to do now. And if you want to look up something that is actually understandable, cryptographic agility, our ability to swap these things out from our core systems is what we need to do now.
Just really quickly, people are vulnerable to post-quantum cryptography issues today because of something we call attack now, decrypt later. So your data, just because people can't decrypt it, doesn't mean they can't collect it now and decrypt it later on. And that's a real challenge. So again, we will have a post-quantum roadmap out very shortly, and that will essentially say that people should be committed to being fully post-quantum resistant by 2035, but in reality today. So the algorithms exist, the cryptographic standards exist. The only issue is that some hardware probably can't run some of those standards, but that's a problem for organizations to deal with. Across government, we're already leading on this exact issue.
And there's a lot of interest in this particular area. Andrew Faroanu, considering the increased risk of harvest now, decrypt later, what are mature organizations doing in terms of taking actions to implement post-quantum cryptography, and how quickly are they doing it? So we've sort of been touching on that. Seamus.
Thank you so much. Seamus Allen, researcher here at the Institute. So my first question, I think you've kind of touched on already. I was going to ask about how we keep up with technological change. So I was thinking of quantum, but also I guess AI and what other technologies are coming and how do we keep up with them effectively and what can businesses learn about that? And my second question I wanted to ask is about critical infrastructure. How do we find the balance in defining what that should be and what it shouldn't be? Thanks so much.
Okay, Joyce.
Yeah, sure. So on the first question, like how do we prepare for the threats of tomorrow? There's another term I like, which is anticipatory governance. Basically, and it touches on what Donald also talked about in terms of having agility in our thinking, because, and I think this is something that Rich mentioned earlier, that, they published the report in October, it's already out of date because the threat landscape is constantly evolving and changing. And here comes, I think, in my mind, the importance of those conversations that not only happen at national level, but also with like-minded, and I would even say, with everyone, right? And in the UN, there are these processes where all member states come together and talk about threats, common threats. And I think, while the UN is, met with a lot of skepticism, it still has a role to play in terms of, even if we disagree, even if we are sitting with adversaries, that we are talking about, what are you doing to be responsible in cyberspace? And I think that is important, that matters. On the critical national infrastructure piece, it is obviously for each country to define what is critical infrastructure to it, because that, and especially in the digital domain, because the more digitized you are, the broader the categorization is, because in the UK, for instance, data centers become like also part of that, but you go to another country that is underdeveloped digitally, that would not feature there. So there is obviously, that is the prerogative of every country to decide what is critical infrastructure. However, there is, and I go back to the UN thing, that there is agreement around norms not to attack each other's infrastructure, to cooperate when they are attacked, to make sure that you are not letting criminals use your territory to conduct their operations. So there are already a normative sort of framework in place to think about, how do we protect critical infrastructure, and what are the roles that we should and should not.
It is a very rich and interesting debate, and everybody is saying very interesting things, but just to encourage you, just keep it as tight as you can. We've about another 10 minutes or so. No, again, it wasn't a reproach. I'm going to come to it, but I'll go to Jacky and then to Richard.
I just want to make a quick comment on the question you asked about threats and how do we keep up with them and the ever-changing technology. There's a piece there that you could spend your entire life dealing with something new every day, but you could actually take a different view, and it's the topic that we have here today about being resilient. Because if you look at what your core fundamentals are of your business, why you're there, what you're doing, and try to make those resilient, the threats will change every day. But the core of what you're doing and you making that technically very resilient won't go away if you invest in that area. So I would say that the question, turn it around and say, how can I become more resilient no matter what happens out there?
Richard, I'll come to you, but could I ask you just either before or after you say what you were going to say, ask you a really interesting question here. Shane McHugh, in an industry where mistakes can have severe consequences, what are the dangers of depending too heavily on AI for threat detection and response? And where should we draw the line between automation and human oversight?
That's a really good question. I'll ask the answer the first one first on CNI. So the good news is that we don't have to think about it anymore because the NIS2 defines it very closely for us. The annexes of NIS2 tell us what critical infrastructure are, and it's written very broadly. Obviously, within that, we can make decisions about things we want to focus on from a risk perspective, but that's it. Just really quickly on the UK. The UK are now doing a revision of their NIS piece, but it's not NIS2. It's like NIS 1.2. So they're going a little bit towards NIS2, but not the same. So we have a regulatory divergence on the island of Ireland, which is something we're looking very closely at with UK colleagues to make sure we don't have a gap or a problem. On the second question, Alex, the issue of oversight, so that's a fundamental problem. It's about automating existing systems, not replacing humans entirely. There has to be a human in the loop, or at least part of the loop, to oversee. So the way we do it bluntly internally is we generate tickets, and a human has to see, sign off, and approve each ticket before anything is done on the basis of it. That doesn't account for automated systems. That's a different conversation.
Interesting. Yeah. Don't log on that.
There are, like, this is a whole other session, but there are quite sophisticated existing approaches to this, like things called policy gateways, explainability, ways for you to leverage AI, but understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. And so this idea that AI is in the corner doing something that I kind of asked it to do, I'm not quite sure why it's doing it, but it's doing it. That's not what I see any organization implementing, or any of your vendors even thinking. They're putting in mechanisms for us to observe the behavior. And I would encourage you, if you're thinking about using it, if you're hearing agentic AI and all these great terms, that idea of explainability, that's your first question. And your second question is, how can I have a mechanism in my organization to govern how it's being used and why it's being used? And those things exist today. It's not a mystery. They exist today.
Very interesting. Yes. We got a microphone to this man here. Tell us who you are and where you go.
Browne Honan from BH Consulting. Just a quick question for the panel. While we all recognize the need and focus we should have on cyber resilience and improving our national cybersecurity, etc., how do we ensure we maintain a balance against security versus our individual fundamental rights to privacy as well?
Okay. And just while the panel are thinking about that, do I see any other offerings from? Yes, sir, over there.
Pat Moran from PwC. Thank you, by the way, for all the speeches so far, really insightful. Donlog, you mentioned it, EU presidency kicks off 1 June.
Yep.
Clients are now starting to talk to me about helping to protect the frontiers when that period starts. Interested just hearing about what we're seeing out there, and particularly what the government are doing to help us during that period.
Two very interesting questions. Jacky, will I go? You can pick either one or both.
Sure. I suppose the data privacy one and the balance on that, like, I know there's a recent bill that a lot of people are talking about in Ireland, in relation to being able to view the endpoints. And what I mean by that, for those people who mightn't be into that, is that if you've got encrypted communications and for whatever reason law enforcement or regulators need to get in and see those for public safety or for the greater good, as decided by a court of law, you can't see them. So what we're saying now is there's a bill been put forward, a proposition that actually we would allow effectively legal spyware on the endpoints, maybe on your phone, that would allow the communications to be intercepted before they get encrypted and go across. I think that's a phenomenally interesting debate, because you can totally see it goes back to the whole Apple debate years ago, the kind of Cupertino, like what do you do if someone's going to die? Is it okay when someone's going to die? Is it okay to protect human rights? I think it's a much bigger conversation than we could really have here. Like, I really do, like, you're opening up a lot there. From a technical perspective, it's possible to do all these things. Whether we should or not is a different question.
Well, it's one of the most profound questions, isn't it, that's facing this whole debate. And, we'll try and get an opportunity to come back to it if we can. Richard,
Yeah, just on that bill hasn't been published yet, so the content of it will be determined over time. And obviously we have a somewhat of a stake. Just on the presidency, that's a really good question. The state will be in the presidency of the European Union for the second half of the year. So we have a program of events from a cyber perspective running up to that. So we have a national exercise in early May, which will focus on rehearsing literally how we respond to a hybrid type event during a major presidency event and the work around that. So that's a key part in bringing everybody in the state together to understand how to manage these. We also have a risk assessment, which is complete. A version of it, but the full version will be provided to ministers very shortly. But then we may well publish a redacted version of it, or a shortened version of it for public consumption, just so people understand the nature of the risks we see. But again, they're basically generated in the risk assessment anyway. It is the usual hybrid disinformation and so on type issues. Beyond that, there's a lot of other work that we're doing to bolster defences in government and elsewhere. Statutory powers to do it better is really important for us, but that legislation isn't published yet. So that's a risk factor for us, but one we can manage. But the long and the short of it is we will also then be working with our cores, so 250 critical infrastructure operators, and providing them with the risk assessments and explaining to them what it is we think they should be looking at now. So there's a lot of stuff happening, which will become public in the next little while.
Joyce, there were two questions there, and you can pick one or other of them. I mean, obviously the presidency, I think Richard has dealt with that's a particular interesting period now for Ireland. But the sort of
look, this
philosophical questions.
I mean, the sort of the rights versus security is like a very, very old debate. And I think, on the encryption piece that Jacky talked about, the argument has always been made that, yes, you can have a backdoor for law enforcement, but as soon as you have a backdoor for law enforcement, then, it will be used not just by law enforcement, so you're opening the floodgate. And do you want to do that? But also, there are bigger questions. Like I was part of the negotiations as a kind of civil society of the Cybercrime Convention that states agreed to last year. And there were lots of discussions around, human rights and privacy, especially, and what does it actually mean? This is, we think this is okay. And, there was lots of pushback, and eventually the convention did take into consideration lots of the comments that were made, but still there remain some issues that were not fixed. And the convention continues now with additional protocols, etc. I think the way to kind of think about this is that ensuring that we have those platforms and those channels to continue the discussions, as we think about policy solutions.
Very interesting. Donlo?
Maybe slightly complementing what Richard said about preparation for what might come next. I think the good news is, other European countries have obviously gone through some similar things in the recent months, and we've learned a lot from the Danes, for example, and they've published what has happened to them. I think whether you're a private sector body or a public sector body, which you'll have lots of the things that Richard talked about, I think it is a moment to think about how is it going to impact my business? What are the potential angles of attack that I could experience, and learn from what others have experienced to prepare for that? Because maybe there are things in your agenda that you might want to accelerate, especially, those things that happened in the UK, that the challenge was not that organizations weren't defended. It was when those defenses failed, what happened next, and a lack of preparation and a lack of thinking about that is perhaps something to consider.
That seems like a good, strong point on which to finish, but I'm going to just give it another, literally sort of 2 minutes. I can see my colleague Keane has a quick question, and he'll make it quick, I know. And there's another one I have here that if I have a chance, I'm going to ask it. I'm going to give the panel a minute each, if that's okay, to finish. So, yes, Keane.
I promise this will be quick. Just on the note of kind of regulatory diplomacy, regulatory divergence and geopolitics in general, so that across the Atlantic, the United States has generally had a kind of a different approach to cybersecurity regulation, relying a little bit more on voluntary practices, or at least when I interact with American interlocutors, that tends to be the sense. But currently, the current administration is currently changing that to make these even more voluntary. And I'm quite interested, just given the interlinkages between all of these systems, just how might this interact? How might these different approaches to regulation affect the whole cybersecurity ecosystem?
Martin Clancy, you're not going to all be able to answer both questions, but Martin Clancy says, most of us in the public and private sectors are hugely dependent on tech from US MNCs. What does EU OS look like? Is this open source, as we have heard of organizations recently switching to? What is the panel's view on this as a realistic option? So again, we could have a whole afternoon on that, but I just didn't. So those two, you don't have to answer necessarily both of them, or perhaps even either. If you have a closing remark, we'll take it. And I'll go from this side, if that's okay, Richard.
It's quite all right.
Right across.
I mean, just
a minute if you can.
Yeah, even less. The EU OS is a nice idea. We are 2 decades away from a situation where the European Union can realistically exert a degree of tech autonomy. That's the timeframes practically. And so it's not a realistic possibility. The question really is, are the critical systems we want to ensure are not reliant on anybody else? Some of that's happening in cloud and other areas, but there are specific areas, mobile OS is a case in point, where you might look at specifically. Those are downstream questions. Just on the other question on regulatory engagement with the US, it's a huge question, but basically what's happening is the US is importing EU regulatory standards because it has to. But in turn, we're using US standards to frame ours. So there is a congruence of regulatory processes here. It's just it has legal force in the EU and doesn't in the US.
Oh, okay. Again, very interesting. Donald.
I'm going to finish on my practical theme of what can we do. And I guess if you're not simulating the things you want to turn off and the things you need to turn on, now's probably a time to think about that. Move away from the tabletop exercise, the paper-based exercise, and think about how you might practically demonstrate what your core business is when it comes to that moment that I don't want for any of you. What is your core business and how do you protect it?
Terrific. Joyce?
Maybe quick word on the dependency piece. And I think, you know, the last couple of years have shown us like what weaponization of dependency can look like and how important it is to protect against it, but equally to recognize that diversification is costly and slow, and one has to adopt a practical approach to it. Keep an eye, monitor what's happening, and have rapid response towards potential weaponization, and have long-term objectives.
Super.
And for me, regulation is a baseline. Any organization who wants to, you know, exist needs to look at this regulated or non-regulated. They need to make sure that they have a level of resilience and that they can survive. And I think the issue of kind of EU tech sovereignty is something we're going to be debating for a long, long time. I think there are many ways that it could be approached if needed to do so. But I think there's people who need to be thinking about what happens, you know, if we decided we actually needed that one day, what position are we in today? And do we collectively want to do anything about that or not?
Well, thank you. I think you'll agree it's been a really excellent session. I've certainly enjoyed it and got so much from it. Thank all of the panel, particularly obviously Jacky Fox for your introductory remarks and also for rejoining us here. Joyce, Donald Oak, Richard, thank you all. Thanks to the audience. Thanks those of you who are online and in the room. I think this is a topic we'll safely say is a topic we'll be coming back to. Great to work with Accenture and hope to see you all again before too long here at the Institute. Thank you all very much.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.